Let's be real for a second. When you first watched Invincible, when that opening sequence hit, when Nolan Grayson turned to his son and did what he did, you didn't expect to end up here. You didn't expect to be sitting at the edge of your seat, years later, watching a show that keeps pulling the rug out from under you with more precision and more emotional devastation than almost anything else on television. But here we are. Season 5 is confirmed. And I'm going to tell you right now, if you thought the story was brutal before, you have no idea what's coming. Because what's building underneath every conversation, every punch, every quiet moment between Mark and Amber or Mark and Adam Eve, it's a war. Not just a superhero war, a species war. And Mark Grayson is standing right in the middle of it, slowly being crushed by the weight of everything he is and everything he's not allowed to be. So settle in. We're going deep today. Before we talk about Thragg, before we talk about Viltrumites walking around on Earth like they own the place, and they kind of do, we need to talk about Mark. Because if you're not paying attention to what's happening inside his head, you're missing the actual story. Mark Grayson is not okay. And I don't mean that in a casual sense. I mean the kid is being systematically dismantled piece by piece from the inside. Think about the psychological architecture of who he was in Season 1. He was a teenager who wanted to be a hero. Simple as that. His dad was his hero. His world had clear lines. Good guys, bad guys. Punch the bad guys. Save the day. Go home. And then his father, his actual, literal father, nearly beat him to death and flew away. That's not something you recover from in a therapy session. That's not something you process over one emotional conversation. That is a foundational collapse. The person who taught you what it meant to be strong, what it meant to protect people, turned out to be the biggest threat you've ever faced. And Mark still had to get up the next day and put the suit on. He still had to go out there and be invincible. Because if he doesn't, who does? And that's the trap, isn't it? That's the psychological cage Mark lives in. He can't stop. He can't rest. He can't fully grieve or fully heal because the world keeps needing him. The Viltrumite Empire keeps needing to be resisted. Cecil keeps needing him to be a weapon. Adam Eve needs him to be a partner. His mother needs him to be a son. Everyone needs something from Mark, and Mark keeps giving it. And every time he gives it, there's less of him left. What Season 4 started to show us, and what Season 5 is going to push to its absolute limit, is the version of Mark that is starting to crack under all of that pressure. Not crack meaning break. Crack meaning the edges of who he is are starting to blur. He's starting to make harder choices. Starting to sound more like Nolan than he probably wants to admit. And that's terrifying. Not because Mark is evil, but because the road from I'll do what it takes to I'll do anything is shorter than most people think. The show has always been interested in the question of what it costs to be a hero. Not just physically, the broken bones, the blood, the near-death experiences, but spiritually, morally. What does it cost you? What do you give up? And with Season 5 confirmed and the Viltrumite conflict escalating, that cost is about to go up dramatically. Now, let's talk about the character who, in my honest opinion, is one of the most terrifying villains in all of animated fiction right now. And I want to be specific about why, because it's not just about how powerful he is, and he is absurdly powerful. It's about what kind of thinker he is. Thragg is not a villain who loses control. That's the first thing you have to understand. He doesn't rage. He doesn't monologue when he should be acting. He doesn't make the classic mistake of underestimating his enemies because his ego gets in the way. Thragg is disciplined in a way that is almost chilling. He calculates. He waits. He positions. And when he finally moves, it's with the total commitment of someone who has already run every possible scenario in his head and decided this is the one he wins. His entire philosophy is rooted in Viltrumite supremacy, but not in the clumsy, cartoonish way of a dictator who just wants power. Thragg genuinely believes that the Viltrumite race is the pinnacle of existence, and that every decision he makes in service of that belief is not just justified but necessary. He sees himself as a guardian of something sacred, a caretaker of a species that almost went extinct and rebuilt itself from near nothing. That conviction, that absolute, unshakable sense of purpose, is what makes him so dangerous. Because you can't appeal to his better nature. You can't find the hidden vulnerability of loneliness or self-doubt. Thragg doesn't have those. Or if he does, he buried them so deep they don't function anymore. What we know from the comic source material, and what the show has been carefully laying the foundation for, is that Thragg's long game involves population. That's the real play. He's not just trying to conquer Earth militarily. He's thinking generationally. He understands that the Viltrumite Empire's greatest weakness is its lack of numbers, and he has a plan to fix that. And it's a plan that unfolds over decades, not months. This is a villain who is playing chess while everyone else is playing checkers. And the scary part is, he's winning. Thragg's return in Season 5 isn't just a rematch. It's the arrival of a threat that has been growing in the background, off-screen, while Mark was dealing with everything else. And when it lands, it's going to feel like a wall. Because Thragg doesn't come back smaller. He comes back having used every moment of his absence to become more of what he already was. I want to say something that I think is important here. Thragg works as a villain because the show treats him with respect. It doesn't mock him. It doesn't give him stupid moments so the audience feels safe. It looks at him clearly and says, this being has thought further ahead than you have, is stronger than you are, and believes more completely in what he's doing than almost anyone on the side of good believes in anything. That's not a villain you defeat through cleverness alone. That's a villain that requires everything. Here is something that I feel like the fandom doesn't talk about enough, and I think it's one of the most interesting and terrifying narrative threads in the entire show. There are Viltrumites on Earth right now, not in space, not on some distant planet, on Earth, living among humans. And the implications of that are enormous. Think about what that means on a practical level first. Viltrumites are virtually indestructible by human standards. They age almost imperceptibly slowly. They can fly, they can survive in the vacuum of space. Their physical capabilities are so far beyond what a human can achieve that the comparison almost doesn't make sense. And some of them are just here, walking around, existing in the world that Mark is trying to protect, existing in the world that Cecil is trying to keep stable. Now, some of these Viltrumites are technically on the side of Earth, or at least in a kind of uneasy truce. But here's the thing. How do you trust that? How does Mark trust that? How does any government institution, any military force, any ordinary human being who doesn't have superpowers trust that these beings, who come from a culture built entirely around conquest and dominance, are actually playing nice? You can't just take their word for it. And you can't exactly run surveillance on beings who could level a city block before you finish dialing the phone. The Viltrumites on Earth represent a kind of slow-burning pressure that the show is incredibly smart about. It's not an invasion. It's an infiltration. And it's an infiltration that happened with at least partial consent, which makes it even messier. These aren't soldiers with guns at the border. These are people, or beings, embedded in the fabric of society. And the question of what they want, what they're loyal to, and what they do if Thragg gave the order, that question hangs over every scene they're in. There's also a thematic layer here that I find genuinely fascinating. The Viltrumites on Earth are a mirror for the immigrant and assimilation experience, but pushed to an extreme that makes the stakes visceral. What does it mean to be of one world and living in another? What do you owe the place you came from versus the place you now call home? The show doesn't spell this out in big, obvious terms, but it's in there. You can feel it in the way these characters interact with the world around them. And for Mark, who is himself half Viltrumite and half human, it's not abstract. It's personal. It's his internal conflict made external. The war outside is also the war inside. Okay, I want to spend a minute on Dinosaurus because I think he's one of the most underrated pieces of the puzzle moving forward, and I have a theory that I can't stop thinking about. Dinosaurus is not a straightforward villain. He's not even really a traditional antagonist. He's something more interesting and more uncomfortable than that. He's an accelerationist. He genuinely believes that humanity needs to be shocked into evolution. That the comfortable, incremental way humans approach their own problems is exactly why those problems never actually get solved. He looks at climate change, at war, at inequality, at all of it, and he concludes that the species needs a catastrophic reset to find the will to do better. It's a monstrous position, It's also internally consistent in a way that makes it hard to dismiss entirely, which is what makes him so unsettling. Here's my theory. In Season 5, with Viltrumites present on Earth and the threat of Thragg on the horizon, I think Dinosaurus comes back as a kind of dark mirror to the Viltrumite problem. Because in a twisted way, Dinosaurus and Thragg want similar things. They both believe that the current order needs to be destroyed to make way for something better. They just differ on who gets to survive and what better means. And I think the show is going to use that parallel deliberately. It's going to ask the audience, is there a difference between Thragg reshaping humanity according to Viltrumite supremacy and Dinosaurus reshaping it according to his own radical environmentalist logic? And if so, what is that difference and who decides? This creates an almost impossible position for Mark, because Mark has fought Dinosaurus. He's also worked with Dinosaurus. He understands him better than almost anyone. And when the Viltrumite threat is fully on the table, there's a terrifying version of events where Mark has to consider whether someone like Dinosaurus, with his willingness to make unthinkable choices, is actually useful. Whether fighting a species-level threat requires species-level ruthlessness. And the moment Mark starts thinking that way, the moment he starts treating catastrophic means as acceptable for good enough ends, he's become something else entirely. That's the trap the show has been building toward, and Dinosaurus is the bait in it. Let me take a slight detour here, because I think this matters more than people realize. Conquest is not coming back, and that absence, the absence of one of the most physically intimidating antagonists Mark has ever faced, is actually doing something important for the story. Conquest represented a very specific kind of threat. He was the ultimate expression of Viltrumite combat philosophy. Pure aggression, total commitment, the belief that pain is just information and information can be ignored. Fighting him wasn't just dangerous, it was psychologically scarring. Mark survived those encounters, but he survived them changed. Smaller in some way that doesn't show on the outside. By taking Conquest off the board, the show accomplishes two things. First, it preserves the weight of what those fights meant. If Conquest came back and Mark beat him again, it diminishes the original horror. The permanence of his absence keeps those moments alive. Second, it signals something about where the threat is now located. Conquest was a hammer. Thragg is a scalpel. The show is moving from the kind of threat you can punch into submission to the kind of threat that doesn't come at you directly. It comes at everything around you until you have nothing left to protect. That's a deliberate narrative choice, and it tells you something about what Season 5 is going to feel like. Less of the brutal, almost sports movie energy of a physical showdown, and more of the slow, suffocating pressure of a situation where the rules keep changing and the ground keeps shifting. Mark can't just hit his way through this, and that's precisely what makes it so compelling. Here's the thing that I keep coming back to when I think about where this show is headed. All of the plot mechanics, Thragg, the Viltrumites, the political maneuvering, the escalating threats, all of it is in service of a single central question. And that question is, who is Mark Grayson, really? Not Invincible the hero, not the half-Viltrumite super being, not Cecil's asset or Eve's partner or Debbie's son. Mark, the actual person underneath all of it. Because every layer of the show has been peeling back something to get closer to that core. And what we're going to find there, what Season 5 is going to force into the light, might not be entirely comfortable. Mark has absorbed an enormous amount of violence, loss, and moral compromise. He has watched people die because he couldn't save them. He has made choices that haunt him. He has looked at his father, who betrayed everything he believed in, and then slowly, painfully, started to understand him. Not forgive, understand. And understanding Nolan is its own kind of horror because it means recognizing the logic, the cold, strategic logic, of the Viltrumite worldview isn't entirely foreign to Mark. It lives in his blood. Season 5 is going to push Mark to the absolute edge of who he can be while still being who he wants to be. In Thragg's return, the Viltrumites on Earth, all of these converging pressures, they're not just plot. They're a test. The most important test Mark Grayson has ever faced. Not of his strength, of his soul, Oh, here's where we are. Season 5 is coming. Thragg is coming back, and he is not coming back smaller or softer or with doubts. The Viltrumites are already embedded in the world Mark is trying to protect. Dinosaurus is a wild card that could burn everything down in the name of saving it. Conquest is gone, and that absence shapes what the new threats look like. And Mark Grayson, our guy, the kid who just wanted to be a hero, is carrying all of it. This show has earned every bit of hype it gets. Not because it has great fight animation, though it does. Not because it has a compelling mythology, though it absolutely does. But because at its core, it's a story about what heroism actually costs. Not in some abstract philosophical sense. In the specific, grinding, devastating sense of a person who puts on a suit every day and pays the price and keeps going and keeps giving and wonders in the quiet moments whether there's anything left of himself that's just his. That's the story. That's what we're watching. And Season 5 is going to be something special. If you made it to the end of this, thank you. Genuinely. Drop your own theories in the comments because I know this community has thoughts, and I want to hear them. What do you think Thragg's first move is going to be? What happens when the Viltrumites on Earth have to choose a side? What does Mark look like on the other side of all of this? Subscribe if you want to keep going deep on this. We got a lot more to talk about.